Chapter 15 in the Essene Calendar? Question mark. Few features of the Dead Sea Scrolls are as pervasive or as structurally central as their treatment of time. Across multiple texts, a rigid 364-day solar calendar is not merely assumed but enforced, functioning as an invisible framework upon which law, worship, discipline, and eschatology all depend. Festivals are fixed to immovable weekdays, priestly rotations unfold with mathematical precision, sacred history itself is mapped onto a symmetrical temporal grid. In the scrolls, time is not neutral backdrop, it is sacred architecture. This calendrical system is not presented as one option among many, nor as a speculative ideal. It is treated as the only legitimate ordering of sacred time. To observe the wrong calendar is to worship incorrectly, to break covenantal alignment, and ultimately stand outside the community of the righteous. The calendar is the calendar, in other words, is not peripheral theology, it is the community's organizing principle, and yet an uncomfortable question remains largely unasked. Why do the earliest and most detailed descriptions of the Essenes never mention such a calendar at all? This silence is striking precisely because calendars are among the most visible markers of sectarian identity. In Second Temple Judaism, disputes over sacred time would not be just abstract or private matters, they affected pilgrimage, sacrifice, festivals, feasts, fasting, festival observance, and communal coordination with the temple in Jerusalem. A group that rejected the lunar calendar used by the temple and replaced it with a strict solar system, one that permanently rearranged the biblical feasts, would have stood in open public conflict with mainstream Jewish practice. If the Essenes were truly the authors or custodians of the Dead Sea Scrolls, their calendar should have been among their most conspicuous and controversial traits. It would have shaped when they celebrated Passover, how they observed the Sabbath cycle, and whether their worship aligned or clashed. Such a deviation would not have gone unnoticed by contemporaries, especially by observers already intent on categorizing Jewish sectarian differences. Instead, we encounter a near total silence. The earliest sources that describe the Essenes, written by careful inquisition, yeah, written by careful, inquisitive, and often frustrated observers, preserve extensive details about their communal life, moral discipline, institutional rituals, and theological outlook. But on the question of sacred time, they say nothing. No alternative calendar, no solar system, no calendrical polemic. This chapter begins with that absence, not as a gap to be casually explained away, but as a historical problem demanding explanation. If the calendar of the Dead Sea Scrolls truly belongs to the Essenes, it should have been left unmistakable traces in the ancient record. The fact that it did not is not a minor curiosity, it is the starting point for re examining one of the most foundational assumptions in the modern Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship. Nearly everything we claim to know about the Essenes comes from three ancient writers, all composing in the first century AD, and all writing independently of one another. As we have mentioned before, Josephus, a Judean priest, historian, and eyewitness to the Jewish world before and after the war with Rome; Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher deeply concerned with ethics, law, and cosmic order; and Pliny the Elder, a Roman encyclopedist who with no theological stake in Jewish sectarian debates. Together, these three witnesses from the entire classical foundation for the Essenes portray. Despite their different backgrounds, the Despite their different backgrounds and agendas, their descriptions converge on a remarkably consistent picture. The Essenes are portrayed as a group marked by extreme discipline and communal rigor. They live collectively, share property, submit strict moral codes, and pursue a life of ascetic restraint. They are distinguished from other Jewish groups not by geography, but by their way of life, an alternative social and ethic order within Judaism itself. Josephus is especially detailed. He devotes extended passages to Essene life, carefully cataloging their intentions, their yeah, carefully cataloging insti- in their institution. No, no, institution process. I think I'm tired. Yeah, I'm just tired. Communal meals, his hierarchical organization, and disciplinary system. He describes the oaths taken by new members, the penalties imposed for transgression, and the group's distinctive theological commitments. He even pauses to explain their views on fate, the immortality of the soul, and divine justice, topics that go well beyond surface observation. Philo references this picture with his own emphasis on moral excellence, self-control, and communal harmony. For him, the Essenes exemplify a philosophical ideal, a community ordered by virtue, reason, and piety. Pliny, writing from a Roman perspective, situates them geographically and socially, presenting them as a stable and organizable phenomenon within the Judean landscape. In other words, these authors are not offering casual or super yeah. These authors are not offering casual or superficial sketches. They are attentive, curious, and in some cases admiring observers. They notice details of daily practice, internal governance, theology, and ethics. They are fully capable of identifying what makes the Essenes distinctive, and yet, on the matter of sacred time, they say nothing. No alternative calendar is described, no solar reckoning is noted, no dispute over festival dates is mentioned. There is no hint that the Essenes observed the feast on different days from the temple, or that they followed a system that fundamentally restructured the rhythm of Jewish worship. This omission is not the result of ignorance. These authors knew how to describe difference, and they did so at length. The absence of any calendrical reference, therefore, does not reflect a lack of interest or access. It reflects the absence of a phenomenon worth reporting. What the classical sources do say about the Essenes is extensive. What they do not say about the calendar that de- dominates the Dead Sea Scrolls is the tension that now demands closer examination. Josephus is not a casual or attentive observer of Jewish life. As a priest, historian, and participant in the events of the first century, he possessed both insider knowledge and a strong interest in explaining Jewish customs to an external audience. Few ancient writers are as concerned with cataloging sectarian distinctions, ritual practices, and theological disagreements within Judaism. Crucially, Josephus is demonstrably aware of calendrical matters. Elsewhere in his works, he discusses priestly rotations, festival observance, Sabbath cycles, and the structure of sacred time. He understands that calendars are not abstract theories, but mechanisms of authority, tools by which worship is regulated and legitimacy asserted. He also knows that disagreement over timeskeeping are among the more destabilizing forms of a religious conflict, because dema- they determine when observance is possible and when it is not. Generally, scholars will point to this reason for Josephus to not mention the calendar discrepancy. He may have been protecting the Essenes from the Romans, presenting them in a more neutral fashion. That does not make a whole lot of sense to me. If Josephus wanted to present this group as not a threat to the Romans, he would have downplayed the differences in some way, not ignore it. The Romans who observed the Essenes would have automatically noticed this radically different practice, and the only opportunity Josephus had to protect the Essenes would do nothing for them at all. Given the sensibility, it is inconceivable that Josephus would overlook a Jewish group that rejected a lunar calendar used by the Jerusalem temple and instead adhered to a rigid solar system that permanently restructured the biblical feast. Such a practice would not have been a minor internal preference. It would have represented a visible, public, and ongoing rupture within Judaism. A solar calendar of the kind presupposed in the Dead Sea Scrolls would have done at least three things. First, it would have set the Essenes in open conflict with the temple by placing them on different dates for major festivals, undermining shared worship and communal synchronization. It is noted by Josephus that the Essenes did not go to the temple for sacrifice, that does but that had nothing to do with different calendars. He We know this because Josephus also notes that they practiced the Sabbath on the same day. The Essenes had a different practice when it came to the temple animal sacrifices, but that had nothing to do with the calendar. Second, it would have marked them as liturgically deviant in a way far more consequential than communal living or esoteric discipline. Third, it would have distinguished them more sharply from other Jewish groups than any social custom Josephus actually records. And yet, Josephus records none of this. He does not describe Essene festival's observance as anomalous. He does not note disagreements over dates. He does not frame them as temporally separatist or chronologically descendant. On the contrary, his portrait suggests a group that is socially distinctive but religiously coherent within the broader rhythms of Jewish life. This absence cannot be dismissed as accidental. Josephus notices what matters when he is silent, especially where conflict would be expected. That silence itself becomes historical data. The omission of a radically different calendar is therefore not neutral, it is evidentiary. What Josephus omits, Philo and Pliny also fail to supply. Philo of Alexandria also intellectual interests revolve around order, harmony, and the relational structure of the cosmos. No, there's no but. Let's try that again. And the rational structure of the cosmos would have been uniquely predisposed to notice and celebrate a solar calendar grounded in mathematical symmetry and cosmic perfection. His writings repeatedly emphasize numerical balance, neutral law, and the alignment of human practice with the structure of the universe. A calendrical system that fixed festivals to immovable weekdays and embodied idealized temporal order would have aligned seamlessly with the philosophical concerns, and yet Philo says nothing about an Essene calendar. He praises their moral rigor, communal ethos, and contemplative life, but offers no hint that they observe sacred time differently from other Jews. The very feature that should have resonated most deeply with his worldview is entirely absent from his account. Pliny the Elder, though less detailed, reinforces the same pattern. He situates the scenes geographically and describes their distinctive way of life, present them as a recognizable and enduring community, but he offers no indication that they followed an unusual system of timekeeping or celebrated festivals on alternative dates. Even from an outsider's perspective, their temporal practice appears unremarkable. Taken together, all three sources converge on the same portrait. The Essenes are socially unusual, ethically rigorous and communally distinct but temporally orthodox. This convergence creates a widening disconnect between the Essenes of classical literature and the community presupposed by the Qumran calendar text. A group defined by sacred time should leave traces in historical observation. The fact that it does not suggests that the calendar of the Dead Sea Scrolls belongs to a different context, a different intellectual lineage, and perhaps a different period altogether. When the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, try that again. Within the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, the calendar is anything but incidental. It is not a speculative theory or an optional framework or a symbolic abstraction layered onto otherwise conventional practice. It is the structural core around which the entire community is organized. The calendar governs festivals observance, fixing feasts to immovable weekdays, and rejecting any system that allows variation or intercalculation. It regulates priestly courses, mapping liturgical service onto a perfectly ordered cycle that presupposes an unbroken mathematically ideal year. It shapes eschatological expectation, anchoring visions of judgment, restoration, and divine intervention to precise temporal frameworks. It even enforces community discipline, where fidelity to the calendar becomes a test of obedience and loyalty. In the scrolls, yeah, in the scrolls, time is moralized. To follow the correct calendar is to walk in truth. To deviate from it is not merely an error of calculation, but an act of rebellion. Calendrical observation, calendrical observance functions as a boundary marker, separating the righteous from the corrupt, the faithful from those who have strayed. Sacred time becomes a litmus test of conventional alignment or covenantal alignment. This level of centrality matters. Groups can disagree quietly over theology or interpretation, but they cannot disagree silently over time. A community defined by a unique calendar necessarily rivals itself in public life, though mismatched festivals, disputed pilgrimage, rhythms, and visible deviance from temple practice, such differences are not theological, they are lived, repeated, and observable. For this reason, the Dead Sea Scrolls calendar could not have existed uh, unobtrusively in the background of Jewish sect. It would have defined the group more decisively than communal portraits. Yeah. Let's try that again. It would have defined the group more distinctively than communal property, esoteric habits, and institution rights. It would have determined when they gathered, when they fasted, when they celebrated, and when they stood apart from the rest of Israel. And yet, the defining features of the scroll community is precisely the feature ancient observers never noticed. Josephus, Philo, and Pliny all describe Essenes who are socially distinctive but temporally unremarkable. The scrolls, by contrast, presuppose a community for whom sacred time is the primary axis of identity. This disjunction is stark. A calendar that governs everything leaves traces everywhere. The fact that it leaves none in the classical record is not a minor inconsistency, it is the fault line. It is. I'm having things pop up on my screen. The fact that it leaves none in the classical record is not a mild inconsistency. It is the fault line that now runs through the entire Essene hypothesis. If the calendar of the Dead Sea Scrolls does not comfortably belong within the lived religious world of Judaism, the question naturally shifts: where does such a system belong? What cultural environment consistently privileged solar time, fixed sacred observance to immovable dates, treated chronology as the expression of cosmic order and embedded theology within calendrical symmetry itself. The answer is unmistakable: Egypt. Egyptian civilization was built upon solar timekeeping. Centuries before Rome imposed administrative calendars or Jerusalem coordinated temple observance, Egypt operated with a stable solar system designed to mirror the order of the cosmos. Its year was regulated, predictable, and symbolically charged. Sacred time was not adjusted pragmatically, but revered as an ideal structure reflecting divine harmony. Egyptian calendars fixed festivals to specific dates rather than flexible lunar cycles. Priestly service was organized around ritualized rotations embedded in calendrical regularity. Time itself was theological, an expression of Mahat, the cosmic order that sustained both the universe and society. To align with correct time was to participate in divine stability. To disrupt it was to invite disorder. The solar observance did not remain confined to native Egyptian religion. In the Hellenistic period, Egypt, particularly Alexandria, became a crucible of intellectual synthesis. Greek philosophy, Egyptian cosmology, and Jewish tradition interacted intensely, producing producing new ways of thinking about law, nature, and divine order. Chronology was not merely inherited, it was theorized. Alexandria, Egypt's intellectual capital, was home to thriving Jewish philosophical communities whose approach to scripture was often abstract, idealized, and cosmically framed rather than strictly liturgical or temple centered. It was also a space of calendrical experimentation where inherited traditions could be reimagined through mathematical symmetry and philosophical order. Jewish thinkers that there were not constrained by the practical realities of temple sacrifice or pilgrimage. They were free to conceptualize sacred time in new ideal forms. In such an environment, a perfectly ordered solar calendar, immune to lunar irregularities, mathematically elegant, and theologically charged, would not be anomalous. It would be expected. By contrast, in Judea, where sacred time was lived publicly through temple worship, intercalculation, and communal coordination, such rigidity would have generated immunity, would have generated immediate, and visible conflict. The Dead Sea Scroll calendar fits awkwardly in that setting. In an Egyptian or Alexandrian context, however, it fits naturally within the broader tradition of soulized, idolized, and philosophically informed constructions of sacred time. This cultural alignment does not yet determine authorship or dating, but it does shift the center of gravity. The calendar presupposed by the Dead Sea Scrolls reflects a worldview far more at home in Egyptian solar theology than in Judean sectarian practice, and that observation will matter as the argument unfolds. The conceptual bridge between the Dead Sea Scroll calendar and Egyptian solar thought is not abstract, it is embodied in the real historic, historically attested Jewish world. Let's try that again. It is embedded in the real historic. it is it is embodied in a real, historically attested Jewish world. It is embodied in a real, historically attested Jewish world. Alexandria. Jewish Philo himself was Alexandrian. He represents a form of Judaism profoundly shaped by Greek philosophy and Egyptian cosmology, rather than by the practical realities of temple sacrifices and Judean pilgrimage. His writings consistently interpret the law through the lens of cosmic order, numerical harmony, and idealized structure. Scripture for Philo is not primarily a manual for ritual performance, but a revelation of universal truths encoded in symbolic form. This matters because the calendar presupposed in the Dead Sea Scrolls reflects a similar orientation. It is not optimized for lived temple worship, and its necessary adjustments and pragmatic accommodations. Instead, it is idealized, symmetrical, symmetrical, and immune to irregularity, a calendar designed to express perfection rather than to negotiate reality. Time in this system is not managed, it is contemplated. Con- contemplated, I mean. I hope this shutter's not too much longer, I'm dying. If the Dead Sea Scrolls calendar reflects a solarized philosophically ideal Judaism rather than a temple-centered priestly one, Alexandria becomes a far more plausible point of origin than Qumran. It was a setting in which the Jewish thinkers were already reframing inherited tradition in cosmic terms, abstracting law and locality, and embedding theology in mathematical order. From such a context, texts could be composed without reference to Judean liturgical constraints. They could be redacted to emphasize symmetry and ideal structure. They could be preserved within philosophical or communal libraries rather than temple archives. They could even be ideologically framed to represent a purer, truer form of Judaism, standing in judgment over a contemporary practice. Only later would such texts require a historical anchor in Judea, as traditions hardened and origins needed to be localized. Association with an ancient sect like the Essenes and with a site like Qumran could provide the necessary antiquity and geographic legitimacy. Alexandria thus functions as the missing link, a Jewish intellectual environment capable of producing the kind of calendrical system found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, without generating the conflict that such a system would have provoked in Judea. It offers a coherent cultural home for the ideas embedded in the calendar, even before questions of transmission, preservation, or later attribution are fully addressed. At this point, the problem may no longer be the calendar alone, but the category used to explain it. The term Essene may not describe authorship in any strict historical sense. Instead, it may function as a retroactive container, a flexible label into which anomalous texts were placed once they required an ancient pedigree and a recognizable sectarian home. In the ancient sources, the Essenes already occupied a liminal position within Jewish memory. They were known but not fully understood, described but never precisely located within mainstream religious life. Josephus portrays them as disciplined and morally rigorous, yet socially withdrawn. Philo presents them as philosophical exemplars, detached from ordinary concerns. Pliny situates them geographically, but offers little insight into their inner world. In short, these scenes were already mysterious and limited, direct documentation, esoteric set apart from ordinary social structures, and separatists living on the margins of Jewish society. These traits made the Essenes an ideal narrative host, a group that was disdained, withdrawn, and sparsely documented, could absorb features that were otherwise difficult to explain, texts that did not fit comfortably within known streams of Judaism could be assigned to the Essenes without immediate contradiction, precisely because the Essenes were already imagined as different. This reframing shifts the burden of explanation, rather than assuming that the scrolls reveal hidden Essene doctrines previously unknown to observers. It becomes possible that the Essene label was stretched to accommodate texts whose true origins were uncertain, contested, and or ideologically inconvenient. The label explains the anomaly by containing it, rather than by historically grounding it. Such a process is not unusual in the construction of ancient intellectual history. When texts resist easy classification, they are often assigned to marginal groups whose boundaries are already indistinct. Over time, the category absorbs the anomaly, and the anomaly comes to define the category. In this light, the Essenes may not be the authors behind the Dead Sea Scroll calendar at all. They may be an interpretive solution adopted after the fact, a name that allowed dis, dis, disparate, desperate texts that allowed desperate text practices and ideas to be housed within a single ancient sounding framework. The result is a narrative that feels coherent, but only because its internal tensions have been relocated rather than resolved. When the evidence is allowed to speak without the constraints of inherited assumptions, an Egyptian, or more specifically Alexandrian origin for the Dead Sea Scrolls calendar resolves multiple tensions at once. What appears anomalous and contradictory within a Judean framework becomes a coherent when placed within a different cultural and intellectual environment. The Egyptian or Alexandrian context explains the centrality of a solar calendar. In Egypt, solar timekeeping was not a novelty or a provocation. It was foundational. A rigid symmetrical calendar governing worship, priestly order, and eschatological expectation would have felt natural rather than disruptive. Sacred time was understood as an expression of cosmic order, not negotiable ritual convergence. Such a context also explains the absence of calendrical disputes in Judean sources. If the calendar reflected in the Dead Sea Scrolls was not being practiced publicly in Judea, then Josephus, Philo, and Pliny would not have anything to report. The silence of the classical sources ceased to be puzzling once the calendar is no longer assumed to belong to a Judean sect operating in visible conflict with the temple. The philosophical tone of the many Dead Sea Scroll texts likewise find a more comfortable time in Alexandria. Idolized law, cosmic dualism, symbolic numerology, and abstract moral order align more closely with the intellectual habits and diasporic Jewish philosophy than with the practical administration of temple worship. These texts read less like manuals for a lived ritual life and more like constructions of an idealized sacred world. An Egyptian or Alexandrian setting also provides a natural explanation for the later Christian tones often observed in the scrolls. Alexandria was one of the earliest and most influential centers of Christian thought, where Jewish scripture was read typologically, cosmically, and ethically rather than narrowly ritually. A body of text shaped in that environment would not require extensive Christian reworking to sound Christian adjacent. The conceptual overlap would already be present. Finally, this model accounts for the persistent disconnect between the scrolls and the historical Essenes. If the Essenes were never the originating community, then the lack of calendrical testimony, the mismatch in priorities, and the absence of visible conflict all fall into place. The scene label becomes explanatory, shorthanded rather than historical description. This alternative origin also aligns chronologically a post 70 AD or post 135 AD environment after the destruction of the temple and the suppression of Jewish autonomy created conditions in which Jewish thought outside of Judea was freer to innovate, theorize, and idolize. Removed from the practical demand of a temple worship and calendrical coordination, sacred time would be reimagined without immediate consequence. In such a world, the calendar of the Dead Sea Scroll no longer appears as an esoteric survival. Let's try that again. In such a world, the calendar of the Dead Sea Scrolls no longer appears as an esoteric survival from a lost sect. It emerges instead as a product of a broader intellectual moment, one shaped by the diaspora, philosophy, and the search for order after catastrophe. Calendars are never incidental. They determine when worship is possible, who holds authority, and how communal identity is maintained. Sacred time governs access to festivals, regulates priestly service, and synchronizes a people's religious life. For this reason, the calendars are among the most visible and contested features of any religious community. A community defined by time leaves traces. Its calendar is observed publicly, contested by rivals, and noticed by observers, especially by those who are curious, critical, or intent on cataloging differences. When a group deviates from the dominant system, that deviation does not remain hidden. It announces itself repeatedly, year after year, in lived practice. The Essenes described by Josephus, Philo, and Pliny leave no such trace. These authors notice what makes the Essenes distinctive. They record their discipline, communal structure, esoteric practices, moral rigor, and theological outlook. They describe a group that stands apart socially and ethically. But on the question of sacred time, the very axis around which the Dead Sea Scroll community is organized, they are silent. That silence speaks loudly. It suggests that the calendar presupposed by the Dead Sea Scroll does not belong to historical Essenes at all. Instead, it points to a different intellectual lineage, one in which the solar time, mathematical symmetry, and cosmic order are treated as theological ideals rather than practical liturgical necessities. Such a lineage is far more at home in Egyptian and Alexandrian thought than in the lived temple-centered Judaism of Judea. If this is correct, then the traditional narrative must be inverted. The Essenes are not the authors of or custodians of the Dead Sea Scroll calendar. They are the interpretive shelter, a name that provided antiquity, distance, and plausibility. Once the text required a historical home. In this light, silence is not weakness in the evidence, it is the evidence. Okay, I shouldn't have read that chapter today. That did not go too well, but we got through it. Kinda. So, we're done. It's the end of that chapter.